"Don't touch anything of mine." Grayson Calloway said it in that flat, measured voice of his. The voice of a man reading a clause in a contract, leaning against the doorframe of the dressing room, while his wife on paper folded the one old sweater she had carried into this tower on the day she arrived. Margot Ellison did not argue. She set the emerald brooch, the only wedding gift he had ever given her, down on the vanity, gently and precisely, the way one returns a borrowed thing, and closed her suitcase. Inside were only what she had brought 11 months ago: a few worn clothes, her late mother's leather-banded watch, and a small brown notebook. The man who ruled half of Chicago's underworld believed he had just cut a traitor out of his life, as cleanly as striking a false number from a ledger. But there was one thing those cold gray eyes did not see beneath the rim of the suitcase: her gloved hand pressed softly against her stomach. In a tower where everything carried an invoice bearing the Calloway name, the woman being sent away empty-handed was carrying out the one thing his entire empire could not appraise, could not buy back, and could not reclaim. It would be a long time before he learned what she carried through that door. And when he did, the man who had never raised his voice, never felt his hands tremble at anything, would have to learn all over again what it truly means to lose everything. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss the stories that stay with you. Many years before the day she packed her suitcase and walked away from that tower, Margot Ellison had believed her life would one day become peaceful in the simplest way a woman could dream of. She had once had a fiancé, a wedding dress hanging behind the closet door, and a mother who sat knitting beside the window every afternoon. Then everything collapsed within a single winter. 3 days before the wedding, the man she had loved for 4 years sent her a message that was not even 3 full lines long, telling her that he was going to marry the daughter of a banker, that he was sorry, and that life sometimes offered opportunities a person simply couldn't refuse. Margot read the message exactly once, then turned off the screen. She didn't call him back. She didn't beg. In that moment, she understood something she would carry with her for the rest of her life: that once someone had placed her on a scale against money, every tear she shed would only make the scale tip farther toward the other side. She returned the wedding dress she had never gotten the chance to wear, and she thought fate had already taken enough from her. She was wrong. That same winter, her mother fell ill, struck by a terrible disease that arrived as quietly as snow falling beyond the window, yet covered everything it touched. Margot sold her small apartment, sold her old car, and even sold the earrings her mother had given her on the day she graduated, trading all of it for hospital corridors, washed in white light, and bills that seemed to have no bottom. Every night, she sat beside the hospital bed, holding the thin, fragile hand of the woman who had given her life, and learned how to smile while her heart was breaking, because her mother didn't need to see fear in her daughter's eyes. She only needed to see that her daughter was still standing. By the time spring reached the doorstep, her mother was gone, leaving Margot with only 2 things: a worn leather-strapped watch she had worn throughout 30 years of teaching, and a hospital debt so large that every time Margot looked at the number, she had to remind herself to breathe. She buried her mother on a windy morning, standing alone beside the grave because there was no one left to stand beside her. Then she went home, opened her computer, and began searching for work, because the dead needed peace, while the living still had debts to pay. It was that debt that led her to the doors of Calloway Holdings, a corporation that occupied all 40 floors of a glass tower reflected in the river below, where the salary offered for the position of private secretary was 3 times higher than anywhere else in the city, and everyone in Chicago quietly understood why. People said no secretary of Grayson Calloway had ever lasted more than 4 months. One woman had quit after only 2 weeks, leaving behind a resignation letter with a hurried line saying she would rather be unemployed than work inside a freezer. Margot read those rumors, then looked at the amount of debt on her screen, and submitted her application. She was no longer rich enough to be afraid. On her first day, someone led her through a marble lobby so silent it felt sealed away from the rest of the world, then stopped before a private elevator that could only be opened with a fingerprint. The human resources manager lowered her voice and gave Margot 3 warnings: never be late, never ask questions that weren't part of her duties, and never allow emotion to show in front of the boss. The elevator doors opened onto the 40th floor, and Margot stepped into a world so quiet she could hear the heating system breathing steadily inside the walls. A long corridor paved in gray stone stretched past heavy wooden doors, looking exactly like the passageway inside a bank vault, except for the absence of turning locks. The man seated behind the desk at the far end of the corridor didn't look up when she entered. He left her standing there for a long while, long enough to make anyone else grow restless, before finally speaking, his eyes still fixed on the documents before him. He said his previous secretary had cried during her first week, and he hoped Margot hadn't brought that habit with her. Margot replied in an even voice that she had already spent all her tears on things that deserved them more, and that if he wanted to see how long she could endure, he could begin with the stack of files sitting crookedly at the corner of his desk, because from where she stood, she could already see at least 3 folders clipped together in the wrong order. For the first time, those gray eyes lifted from the page and looked directly at her. There was no warmth in them, but no hostility either. It was simply the gaze of a man who had just heard an unfamiliar sound inside a house whose every noise he thought he knew. Then he nodded toward the stack of files, and Margot Ellison began her first day of work in the tower she would one day leave, carrying a suitcase and a secret. She survived there not because of her beauty, and not because she knew how to endure in silence, but because of the one thing life hadn't managed to take from her, the careful precision of a woman who had lost everything and understood that when the world cast you aside, caution wasn't surrender. It was preparation. If Margot learned the lesson of her life from a 3-line message, then Grayson Calloway learned his from a recording device no larger than a matchbox. He was 26 that year, newly in control of the first branches of the family business, and he was in love with a young attorney named Sloane Fairbanks, with all the clumsy sincerity of a man who had grown up in a house where no one ever embraced anyone. She was intelligent and sharp, knew exactly when to laugh and when to remain silent. And Grayson, who had been taught since childhood to question even a relative's handshake, allowed himself for the first time in his life to believe that someone had come to him for something other than the Calloway name. He ordered the ring, chose the date, and 4 days before the wedding, on an evening that seemed no different from any other, he wrapped his arms around her from behind, and his fingers touched a small, hard object fastened beneath her clothing at the waist. It was a recording device, and it was running. The room was so quiet that he could hear the tiny wheel turning steadily inside it, capturing every breath he took. Sloane didn't cry. She didn't fall to her knees. To her credit, she had the courage of a gambler who already knew she had lost. She simply straightened her back and told him that a rival family had paid for every tape, that it had all been business, and that if he were thinking clearly, he would understand that in their world everyone had to choose a side. Grayson didn't raise his voice. Even then, he didn't raise his voice. He merely released her as quietly as a man, setting down an object that no longer belonged to him, then walked to the safe, counted out $2 million in cash, placed it inside a leather case, and set it in front of her. Then he spoke the only words that Chicago's underworld would later repeat like a legend, telling her that this was the full amount the other side had promised to pay her, and that she should take it so she wouldn't have to keep pretending for the remaining 4 days. The wedding was canceled in an announcement even shorter than the message Margot would receive from her own fiancé many years later. And from that night forward, Grayson Calloway locked a door inside his chest and threw the key into the deepest part of the river. He continued living. He continued expanding his empire. He continued sitting at the head of the table during dinners where mothers pushed their daughters toward him like pieces across a game board. But he looked at every one of them, the way an accountant looked at a column of figures. And he found a certain peace in that, because a man who trusted no one could never be betrayed. Nearly a decade passed that way, until one afternoon the family's elderly attorney, a man who had served the Calloways since Grayson's grandfather was still alive, came to the office on the 40th floor, carrying an envelope sealed with red wax, and wearing the expression of someone forced to deliver news no one wished to hear. His grandfather's will, written before the old man's death and ordered to be opened only at a precise time, stated in language that left no opening for argument that Grayson would retain permanent control of the corporation's majority shares under one condition. He had to produce a lawful heir before his 35th birthday. Otherwise, everything would pass to the only other remaining person of Calloway blood, Preston Whitlock, a distant uncle, with the smile of a philanthropist and a habit of appearing in newspaper photographs at charity galas. Your grandfather, the old attorney said softly, only wanted to make certain this family didn't die with you. Grayson remained silent for a long time after the door closed. He looked down at the river winding between the buildings and did what he had always done when faced with a problem. He pushed emotion aside and searched for the answer. He needed a wife on paper, a woman who wouldn't indulge in fantasies, wouldn't perform the theater of love, and wouldn't turn the marriage into a prolonged act of extortion. As he considered every woman who had passed through his life, he realized that the only one who met every requirement was sitting just beyond his door, behind the secretary's desk, where she had remained steady through season after season while all those before her had fled. She was the woman who had never asked him for a favor, never complained about her circumstances even though he knew the weight of the debt she carried, and never looked at him with calculation or fear. She simply worked, precise and quiet as a well-made clock. That evening, he called her into his office. He didn't invite her to sit. He placed a prepared set of documents on the desk and spoke in the even tone of a man reading the terms of a contract. He told her that he required a lawful marriage and an heir, and that in exchange, every debt she carried would be erased within a day, and her future would be guaranteed in writing. This was a business proposal, nothing more, and she had one night to consider it. Margot looked at the documents, then at the man standing with his back to her beside the wall of glass, and asked him only one question. Did he intend to pretend that he loved her? Grayson answered no. Never. She said that was acceptable, because she had grown tired of men who pretended. The marriage contract was signed on an early winter evening in the private conference room on the 40th floor, witnessed by exactly two people, the elderly attorney and Whitfield, the butler who had served the Calloway family for 30 years and possessed the eyes of a man who had watched far too many contracts signed in that room. There were no flowers, no exchange of rings, no camera, only two sets of documents placed side by side on the walnut table and two fountain pens with silver caps. After the ink on the final signatures had dried, Grayson rose, walked toward the wall of glass overlooking the city as its lights began to glow, and spoke in the voice of a man determined to put an end to every possible misunderstanding from the very beginning. He said he would tell her this only once. She would never receive love from him, not because she lacked anything, but because that particular thing had once been used like a blade slipped between his ribs, and a man only needed to be cut open once to learn never to lie down on an operating table again. Beyond that, she would find him fair in every matter. Money, position, respect, all of it would be provided in full and on time, like a salary properly paid. Margot listened without blinking, then folded her copy of the documents neatly and replied that in that case, they would work well together, because she had come there to do a job, not to be loved, and in her experience, promises of love were the very things that left people with nothing. The elderly attorney bent over his briefcase to conceal an expression that was difficult to name, while Whitfield, as he escorted her to the elevator, quietly told her that in 30 years of service, it was the first time he had ever seen anyone answer Mr. Calloway without a tremor in their voice. She moved into the penthouse, occupying the top 2 floors of the tower that weekend, still carrying the same old suitcase, and from the very first night, she understood that the place wasn't a home. It was a carefully oiled machine, operating like a safe that knew how to breathe. Lights turned on and off according to a fixed schedule. Meals were served at the precise minute and removed nearly untouched, and the staff moved without sound and never looked anyone directly in the eye, as though they were being paid to become invisible. Margot had spent her whole life among people the world considered invisible. Her mother had taught for 40 years and had been remembered by name by her students until her final day. So the first thing Margot did during her first week, as the tower's mistress on paper, was learn the name of every person who worked there, from Whitfield the butler, to the young security guard on the night shift in the lobby, from the Polish head cook who made the finest stew Margot had ever tasted, to the cleaner who worked in the basement, and whom no one in that building had bothered to ask her name in all the years she had been there. Margot asked. She remembered. And the following morning, she called each of them by the correct name and thanked them for something specific they had done. In their eyes, she saw the same bewildered light, the light of someone invisible being seen for the first time. Then she began doing what she did best. She asked Whitfield for the complete household expense records from the previous 2 years, something no mistress of the house before her, if anyone had ever truly deserved that title, had bothered to examine. She sat with those records for 3 nights beneath the glow of a desk lamp, comparing every line with the habits of a woman who had once been forced to weigh the price of a packet of medicine. She found things that had no place in a supposedly perfect machine. Food invoices for parties that had never taken place, maintenance charges for equipment that had already been replaced, and small, steady discrepancies that accumulated like persistent rain, never large enough for anyone to notice, yet when gathered across more than a year, they formed a number that made her set down her pen and sit in silence for a long while. She didn't cause a scene. She quietly corrected the system, changed suppliers, required original invoices, and introduced a new ledger in which every expense had to pass beneath her signature. Within a month, the machine ran more smoothly, felt warmer, and cost considerably less than it had before, even though the meals had improved, and there was never a shortage of firewood in the hearth. Grayson said nothing about any of it. He said little about most things, but he noticed, because eyes trained to read columns of figures couldn't help noticing. The numbers grew cleaner each month. The head cook hummed while she worked. The young night guard stood straighter when he greeted them. And one evening, Whitfield, who had never offered half a word of opinion about anyone in 30 years, remarked casually as he poured the wine that the building seemed to have some warmth in it lately, sir. Grayson didn't answer. He merely looked down into his glass and told himself that it was nothing more than the inevitable result of hiring the right person for the right job, a perfect calculation, and nothing more, because he wasn't yet prepared to admit, even to himself, that one afternoon he had left a meeting earlier than usual, for no reason at all, except that he wanted to go home. Margot came to understand who the man beside whom she had signed her name truly was. One evening near the end of the month, when news from the Raven's Trace nightclub, one of the family's oldest establishments, reached the 40th floor through the cautious voice of the assistant manager. The club's manager was a man named Dutch Reiner, who had worked for the Calloway family for 6 years and had granted himself the authority of a petty king. He had been caught withholding the tips of the entire service staff for months, and when Mr. Kilivade, Albie, the club's oldest server, a man who had carried trays there since Grayson's father still occupied the owner's chair, questioned him about the missing money, Reiner had treated the old man roughly in the middle of a shift, in full view of the entire staff. Margot expected anger, a thunderous command, something worthy of all the stories about the underworld she had heard. But Grayson merely listened to the entire report, tapped his index finger twice against the desk, then told her to reserve a table for 3 at Marcelin, the finest restaurant in the city, where the waiting list stretched through an entire season, and to send Reiner an invitation specifying formal evening attire. She sent the invitation without understanding, and she only began to understand when she saw Reiner's face as he entered Marceline the following night, pale as a man who had just been served a court summons, because in the world of men like him, everyone knew an unwritten rule. When Grayson Calloway was angry with someone, he didn't summon that person to his office. He invited him to dinner. That evening, the restaurant operated as though only one table existed. The manager personally poured the water, and Margot sat slightly behind Grayson with her notebook, witnessing a display of power that required no threat at all. Grayson ordered for the entire table in a courteous voice, asked about the wine harvest, praised the appetizer, and made no mention whatsoever of the club, while Reiner sat across from him, his silverware rattling in hands that couldn't remain still, sweat slowly seeping through his stiffly starched shirt. He ate as though he were swallowing stones, because nothing wore down the nerves of a guilty man more thoroughly than waiting for his sentence beneath the sound of piano music. After the third course, when the coffee cups had been placed on the table, Grayson finally wiped the corner of his mouth with his napkin, folded it into 4 neat sections, and began speaking in the same voice he used when reviewing quarterly reports, neither faster nor slower. Before the snow outside had time to melt, he said, the following 3 matters would be completed. First, every dollar Reiner had withheld from the staff would be repaid twice over, delivered directly into each person's hands with a signed receipt. Second, a voluntary letter of resignation, politely worded, would be on the assistant manager's desk before the end of the week. Third, Reiner would find another city whose climate suited him better, because Chicago was about to become very cold for men Grayson no longer wished to see. Then he added, like a final note at the bottom of a page, that Mr. Albie had served the family since before Reiner knew how to tie a necktie, and that the Calloway house had a rule older than any contract. Anyone who laid a hand on one of Grayson's people had already signed a document without reading its terms carefully enough. Then he stood, thanked them for dinner, and walked out, leaving Reiner motionless before a cup of cold coffee. As Margot put on her coat and followed, she saw that the trembling manager still didn't dare rise from his chair. On the drive home, she asked why Grayson hadn't simply fired him, and Grayson looked through the window at the snow beginning to fall and replied that firing punished only one man, while a dinner like that punished 1,000, because the story would repeat itself through every kitchen, every bar, and every card table in the city. From that moment on, no one would dare keep a single dollar in tips from any old man carrying a tray under the Calloway name. In the weeks that followed, Margot gradually began to understand the weight of the name she carried on paper. She watched the chairman of a major bank cancel 2 meetings simply because Grayson called and wished to see him that same day. She saw powerful men enter an elevator beside him and instinctively retreat into the corner, lowering their eyes toward their own shoes. She even heard uniformed officials change their tone halfway through a conversation when they learned whose office they had called. The entire city feared that man. She understood that, and she knew she should probably have feared him too. Yet that night, as she recorded the 3 terms of a sentence delivered in the voice of a man reviewing a report, she found herself thinking of Mr. Albee and the doubled payment that would arrive with a signed receipt. For the first time, she dimly sensed that beneath all that thick ice, something existed that moved according to rules of its own. It was cold and frightening, yet it stood far closer to justice than many things she had witnessed in places filled with brighter light. After the dinner at Marcelin, Margot's work quietly expanded beyond the duties of a secretary, not through any formal appointment, but simply through the increasingly thick ledgers that began appearing on her desk, as though the tower itself had decided that anything requiring a meticulous pair of eyes belonged to her. And it was because of this that, on a winter night, when every light on the 40th floor had gone dark except the lamp on her desk, Margot found the fracture hidden inside the accounts of the Nine Hopes Casino, the family's largest establishment on the lakeshore. She hadn't been assigned to examine that place. She was merely following the old habit of a woman who had once been forced to count every dollar, cross-checking every figure that passed through her hands. And that night, among thousands of lines of income and expenses, she noticed that the revenue from the high-stakes tables had been altered, according to a remarkably clever pattern. Each night, only a small amount went missing, little enough to slip through every level of review, but accumulated across several quarters, it became $300,000 that had vanished without a trace. More cleverly still, the discrepancy had been arranged so that, if discovered, every document would point toward the accounting team of the investment partner, whose representatives were scheduled to sit down with Grayson and sign a contract renewal the following week. She checked the figures 3 times, then knocked on the door of his office after midnight, placed 2 folders marked with yellow slips of paper in front of him, and said simply that if he signed the renewal the following week without resolving this first, he would either lose $300,000 without explanation, or, worse, falsely accuse his partner at the negotiating table and turn a 10-year alliance into a feud. Grayson read for 10 minutes without speaking. Twice, he looked up at her as though he wanted to ask how she had found something that 2 levels of his own auditors had missed. But in the end, he merely said that the signing would be postponed for 3 days. Those 3 days were enough for his people to trace the scheme to a night shift supervisor who had sold himself to a rival gambling house, a man planted there not only to siphon away money, but to bury a mine of suspicion directly between Grayson and his most important ally. The signing later proceeded without incident. The partner never learned how close he had come to becoming the accused, and when the elderly attorney heard the full story, he simply removed his glasses, polished them slowly, and told Grayson that in 40 years of practicing law, he had never seen anyone save a negotiating table from a secretary's desk. But Margot's character wasn't found only in numbers, and what she did on a morning near the end of winter proved it in a way no ledger could ever record. During her brief conversations with the household staff, she heard the head cook quietly mention that every year around that time, Whitfield asked for half a day away and returned with red eyes, that his wife had died many years ago, before Margot had even been born, and that no one in the tower had ever asked him about it. Margot didn't ask. That morning, before the butler came down to begin his shift, she quietly placed a bouquet of white chrysanthemums in a simple glass vase on the small table in his private room, along with an unsigned card bearing only one handwritten line, asking permission to remember someone with him that day. Whitfield entered, saw the flowers, and stopped in the middle of the room as though time itself had come to a halt. Then the man who had served the Calloway family for 30 years with a straight back and an expressionless face slowly turned toward the wall, raised a hand to his eyes, and remained that way for a very long time. He said nothing to her throughout the day, but from that day forward, Margot's afternoon tea was always brewed to exactly the strength she preferred, though she had never once told him how she liked it. And Grayson, the man who had once been capable of leaving on a business trip for half a month without bothering to give notice, began changing in ways he himself refused to name. He started eating dinner at home, at first blaming the weather, then claiming there was work they needed to discuss, and eventually offering no excuse at all. When the hour came, he simply took his place at the long dining table where he had once sat alone at the head, while now another person sat 3 chairs away. The two of them usually spoke only about accounts and personnel, and occasionally about a book she had left behind in the sitting room. Yet somehow those dinners kept growing longer for reasons neither of them could explain. One afternoon, he stood in his office, listening to the familiar sound of her heels, striking steadily against the stone corridor, drawing closer with every step, and realized that at some point he had stopped reading simply to listen. Before he could prevent it, a question rose inside him, asking when a man who had built his entire life around silence had begun waiting for the sound of someone's footsteps. He closed the folder and told himself it was merely a habit of the ear, nothing more. But that night, for the first time in many years, he recognized just how silent the penthouse had once been, and understood that the silence he had always mistaken for peace had only been a locked safe in which no one had ever lit a lamp. In the midst of those gradually warming days, there came a morning when Margot sat down at her desk and realized that her left wrist had fallen silent. Her mother's leather-strapped watch, the object that had accompanied her through the funeral, through sleepless nights over ledgers, and even through the cold signing of the marriage contract on the 40th floor, had stopped sometime during the night, its 2 hands frozen in place like a breath left unfinished. She changed the battery, wound it, and held it to her ear the way her mother used to do. But inside the old steel case there was only silence. At noon, she asked permission to leave for an hour and carried it to the oldest watch repairman in the historic district, a man who had spent half a century bent over his workbench. The old craftsman opened the back, examined the movement through his magnifying lens for a long time, then looked up with the shake of his head she had feared from the moment she walked in. The mechanism had worn down to its very core. The old gears had stopped being manufactured many years ago. It could be fitted with a new movement, but then it would be nothing more than an old shell holding its familiar shape, while the heart inside belonged to someone else. And in the gentle voice of a man who understood what his customer was holding in her hands, he told her that she would be better off keeping it as a remembrance, because some things, once dead, should be allowed to rest. Margot thanked him, wrapped the watch in a cloth, and returned to the tower wearing the same composed expression she wore every day, because she had grown too accustomed to hiding the small funerals of her own life. She continued reviewing the accounts, continued answering correspondence, continued reminding Grayson of his meetings in the same steady voice. The only difference was that from that day on, her left wrist remained bare, and now and then, in the middle of her work, her right hand would unconsciously reach across and touch that empty patch of skin, the way someone might touch a chair whose occupant had only just disappeared. She thought no one noticed, and indeed no one did, except one man. Grayson Calloway had survived in his world because of his ability to see what others tried to conceal. He had once caught a man lying from nothing more than the rhythm of his tapping fingers, so he couldn't help noticing the emptiness on the wrist of the woman seated outside his office. He couldn't help seeing the gesture repeated each day, her fingers touching the bare skin where the watch had once rested. One evening, after Margot had gone to her room, he asked Whitfield in the most casual voice he could manage what had happened to the old watch the lady of the house always wore. The butler repeated what the head cook had heard, about the elderly repairman in the historic district and the movement that had died beyond repair. Grayson only nodded and offered no comment, then returned to the document before him as though the matter were closed. But the next morning, one of his men knocked on the door of the old watch shop and asked to borrow the description of the mechanism, and sometime that week, the corporate jet made an unscheduled flight to New York, carrying a small cloth-wrapped package to the workshop of a restoration specialist, one of only a handful in the country, the only man who still kept original gears from that old movement, salvaged from watches of the same era that no one remembered anymore. Margot knew nothing about that flight. All she knew was that one morning, many days later, when she sat down at her desk, her mother's watch lay neatly in the center of it. The old leather strap still carried every familiar worn mark. The glass had been polished clear again, and the 2 hands were moving, smooth and steady, as though there had never been a night when they stopped. There was no box, no ribbon, and no note. She lifted it with both hands, held it to her ear, and the tiny ticking sound passed through her like a voice calling from very far away. She went straight to Grayson's office, stood in the doorway with the watch resting in her palm, and asked in a voice she struggled to keep steady whether he had done this, and how, when the old watchmaker himself had said the mechanism was completely dead. Grayson didn't look up from the page. He answered only in his usual even tone that objects which stopped running in his house irritated him, and that she should put it on before she was late for the first meeting of the day. That was all. Margot remained there for one more moment, then fastened the watch around her left wrist, feeling its familiar weight return to the place where it belonged, and walked out without another word, because she knew that if she opened her mouth then, her voice would break. That night, in the privacy of her room, Margot Ellison sat on the edge of the bed, pressed her wrist against her cheek, listened to the steady ticking in the darkness, and cried for the first time since that windy morning beside the grave so many years before. The tears slid down in silence. Not because of pain, because she already knew every corner of pain by heart, but because of something entirely different, something warm and frightening beginning to kindle inside her chest. Something she, the woman who had signed her name to a contract stating that there would never be love, still didn't dare call by any name. The following week, there came an evening when the two of them had to leave the tower to attend the signing with the casino partner, the meeting that had been postponed by 3 days because of the accounting discrepancy, and because the documents required someone who knew every figure in them. Grayson told Margot to accompany him. The 3-car convoy left downtown just as the city lights began to glow, with the familiar black armored vehicle traveling in the middle. Behind the wheel was Boone, the driver who had served the family for 20 years, a quiet man with salt and pepper hair, whom Grayson trusted so completely that he had never once asked which route he intended to take. That evening, Boone chose the shortcut across the old iron bridge spanning the southern branch of the river, a road quieter than usual at that hour. Margot was bent over the file in the rear compartment, while Grayson sat beside her reviewing the terms, and she had just begun to ask him about an authorization signature when a truck appeared in the headlights, blocking the bridge ahead, too close to avoid and positioned too squarely to be an accident. The scream of the brakes had barely begun when the first deafening bursts struck the body of the car like sledgehammers. The window beside Margot blossomed into a white spiderweb directly before her eyes, and in the instant when her body remained frozen, unable to understand what was happening, a wordless force pulled her down onto the floor, and the whole world disappeared beneath the broad shoulder of Grayson Calloway. He covered her before giving a single order, turning his back toward the splintering glass, one hand clamped firmly around the back of her neck as he forced her lower. Only afterward, only once she was completely beneath him, did that steady voice sound through the radio, not even one beat faster than usual, ordering the lead car to block the firing angle, the rear car to move around the right flank, no one to break formation, and no one to pursue. The next 30 seconds lasted like an entire lifetime. Margot lay with her cheek pressed against the trembling floor of the car, hearing through the chest of the man shielding her the beat of his heart. Powerful but never frantic, steady as the footsteps of an army, while beyond the steel, Grayson's men from the 2 escort vehicles poured out and took position behind the open doors. Their answering gunfire was controlled and rhythmic. Not the sound of panic, but the sound of men performing a task they had practiced 1,000 times, forcing the masked attackers behind the truck to retreat toward the far end of the bridge. Then it ended, as suddenly as it had begun. The attackers vanished into the darkness beyond the river, abandoning the truck that blocked the road. The head of security knocked twice on the car door to signal that it was safe, and only then did Grayson move away from her. He pulled her upright, his gray eyes sweeping over her from head to toe, and asked only 2 words. "Are you hurt?" Margot shook her head and realized that his hand was wrapped around her left wrist, directly over the old leather strap, gripping so tightly that she could feel her own pulse striking against his palm. Throughout the long detour back to the tower, through streets he ordered changed again and again, without following any set route, that hand never released her. Grayson stared straight ahead, his face once more the frozen lake she knew, issuing orders over the phone to contain the information. Check the list of everyone who had known their schedule that evening, and review every family establishment. His voice remained the voice he used to approve reports. Only his hand didn't belong to that voice. The hand still closed around her wrist like that of a man who had forgotten what he was holding, or remembered far too clearly. When they reached the private lobby, surrounded by security personnel, he finally looked down, saw his own fingers, and released her slowly, lifting them one at a time, as though correcting a breach of discipline. Then he told her in a voice that had become completely flat that from the following day onward, she wasn't to leave the tower without at least 2 escort vehicles, before turning away to meet with the security team until nearly dawn. Margot returned to her private room, and only when the door closed behind her did her legs begin to tremble. The delayed shaking of a body finally permitted to feel fear after the danger had passed. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. And amid those lingering shocks, another thought, a deeply feminine instinct, that had been quietly growing for several days through mornings when her stomach rejected even the familiar smell of coffee, suddenly rose with startling clarity. She went into the bathroom, opened the small box she had bought 3 days earlier but hadn't found the courage to use, and waited in a silence even heavier than those 30 seconds on the bridge. 2 red lines appeared, straight and unmistakable, without the slightest hesitation. Margot Ellison sat on the cool tile floor, staring at those 2 red lines, and placed a hand over her abdomen, where a tiny life had just been given its name. Within her, a happiness soft as water rose at the same time as a clear awareness hard as steel. She thought of the contract locked inside the safe, with its provisions concerning an heir. She thought of the man who had shielded her from bullets with his own body that night, then released her hand 1 finger at a time, as though correcting an error in conduct. And she understood that she couldn't tell him yet. Not now, because the child inside her had to be welcomed as a human being who was loved, not inspected like a contractual condition, completed on schedule. And if that man ever opened the door inside his chest, she needed to know that he had opened it for her, not because of the will of a dead man. While the tower tightened every ring of security after the night on the iron bridge, elsewhere in the city, inside a cherry wood-paneled study hung with charitable commendations and photographs of handshakes with politicians, a man was arranging his pieces on the board with the patience of someone who had waited for more than half his life. Preston Whitlock had never been in a hurry. Haste was a habit of those who were poor in time, while he was rich in money, rich in connections, and richest of all in the debts other people owed him, debts he planted the way a farmer planted seeds, watering them with kindness offered at precisely the right moment, then saving them until harvest time. The night on the iron bridge had been a failed move. He admitted that to himself when the report reached him. The hired men had ruined the operation, but Preston was the kind of player who never mourned a sacrificed pawn, because even in failure, that move had taught him something valuable. His cold-blooded nephew had used his own body to shield that woman, and a man who did such a thing by instinct was a man who would soon have something to lose. And in Preston Whitlock's hands, something to lose was always something to hold. So he changed the battlefield. He left behind bridges and gun barrels and withdrew to the ground where he was strongest: papers, photographs, and official seals, because he understood a truth that few men in the underworld were willing to understand. To bring down a man who didn't fear knives or bullets, one shouldn't aim at his body. One should aim at the oldest scar in his heart. And everyone in the family knew the scar Grayson Calloway carried. A woman who had once pressed herself close to his heart with a recording device hidden beneath her clothing. Preston only needed to recreate that same nightmare and place a different face inside it. The pieces began to fall into place, quietly and precisely. The first piece was a series of photographs taken from a distance through a long lens, showing Margot Ellison seated inside a small cafe near the park, with a man wearing a gray coat. The photographs were real down to every streak of sunlight, because the meeting itself had truly happened. The only deception was that the man in the gray coat wasn't who the photographs would claim he was. He was a mediocre actor paid to approach Margot and ask for advice about the tax records of his laundromat. But in the file Preston was having prepared, the man's face would be placed beside the official identification card of an agent from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And a 15-minute conversation born from a woman's kindness would become an exchange of intelligence between an agent and an informant. The second piece was money. An account had been opened at an offshore bank through 3 layers of shell companies under the name Margot Ellison, complete with her date of birth and social security number. Every month, it received a payment large enough to imply guilt and discreet enough to appear professional, with the transaction history backdated through the skills of accountants Preston had kept hidden in the shadows for years. The third piece was a living, breathing man, a former employee of the Nine Hopes Casino who had recently been dismissed during the purge following the disappearance of $300,000. Bitter and deeply in debt, he was approached by Preston's men with a thick envelope and a script to memorize. He was to say that he had once seen Mrs. Calloway searching through confidential files after hours, and that he had watched her photograph documents with her phone. His testimony was rehearsed until it flowed as smoothly as the truth. But no matter how skillfully those 3 pieces had been crafted, a fourth was still missing. the most important piece of all, a path that would carry the file directly onto Grayson's desk without leaving Preston's fingerprints upon it, because his nephew distrusted anything that came from him, even a New Year's greeting card. The file had to come from inside the tower, delivered by a hand Grayson trusted without thought. And that was when Preston's most valuable piece was finally set in motion. A piece he had planted long ago and nourished with a debt that wasn't measured in money, but in human life. Someone that person loved lay suspended between life and death, kept alive only by Preston's money. Late one evening, while the shifts were changing and the tower's corridors stood nearly empty, a familiar figure, so familiar that every security camera passed over it as though it were part of the furniture, paused in a place beyond the boundaries of that person's duties for only a little longer than usual, just long enough for a thick brown envelope to be left exactly where it needed to be. Then the figure continued onward, footsteps as steady as they had been for the past 20 years, with only the shoulders bowed under the weight, as though a burden had just been put down, or another burden, far heavier than the first, had just been lifted onto them. In the cherrywood-paneled study, Preston Whitlock poured himself a glass of wine, watched the snow falling beyond the window, and smiled at the thought that he didn't even need to invent a single lie. He only needed to arrange a collection of carefully severed truths in the exact shape of the scar inside his nephew's heart. Then allow Grayson Calloway to take hold of the blade himself. Grayson found the brown envelope on a Monday morning, lying among the usual stack of correspondence on his desk like a snake hidden between pieces of firewood. And later, through many sleepless nights, he would remember that he had opened it with the very letter opener she had once arranged so neatly upon his desk. Inside were photographs, a statement from an offshore bank account, and a typed witness declaration, and the man who had built an entire empire upon the principle of verifying everything 3 times needed only to reach the second photograph before the old ice inside his chest began closing around his heart by instinct. In the picture, Margot Ellison sat across from a man in a gray coat inside a cafe, tilting her head to listen in exactly the same way she tilted it when she listened to him, while beside the photograph lay a brutally clear image of an identification card from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. His reason, the part of him that had uncovered the fraud in the casino accounts and read the intentions behind 1,000 negotiating tables, still spoke. Photographs could be staged, accounts could be opened under false names, witnesses could be bought. Do what you have always done. Verify it 3 times. But that voice gradually drowned beneath another voice, one older and deeper. The sound of the wheel turning steadily inside a small recording device, hidden beneath a woman's clothing nearly a decade before, and the oldest wound in his heart began taking hold of the new blade exactly as someone had intended. He sat motionless before the file for the entire morning, canceled 2 meetings, and inside his mind, every memory from the past 11 months was dragged out and examined beneath the diseased light of suspicion. She had discovered the missing $300,000 that 2 levels of auditors had overlooked. Had that been too skillful? She had learned the name of every person in the tower. Had she built their trust too carefully? She had never asked him for anything. Had she been too patient? And so the very things that had warmed him for almost a year were melted down and recast as evidence. Because once a heart decides to believe the worst, it will rewrite the entire past to serve its verdict. Near the end of the afternoon, he summoned her. Margot entered the office on the 40th floor, carrying the meeting schedule as she did every day, and from the moment she reached the doorway, she knew that something had died inside that room. The man standing beside the wall of glass didn't turn when she entered, and across the walnut desk, the photographs had been arranged in a perfectly straight line like cards laid out before a judgment. He didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. He only asked how much they had paid her, and how long it had taken her to learn to tilt her head that way. His voice was so flat that every word fell like a stone placed carefully upon a grave. Margot approached the desk, picked up the photograph from the cafe, and for one brief moment, she meant to speak. She meant to tell him about the man who had asked for advice on the tax records for his laundromat. She meant to tell him to investigate the date that account had been opened. She meant to remind him that she had been the one who saved his negotiation. But then she looked into those gray eyes, and every word died inside her. Because what she saw there wasn't a question waiting for an answer. It was a sentence already passed before she had entered the room. She had seen that look once before in her life, in the eyes of her former fiancé when he delivered his decision through a 3-line message, the look of someone who had placed her upon a scale and finished weighing her long ago. and with the icy clarity of a woman whom life had cast aside twice, she understood that when someone had already chosen to believe the worst of her, every explanation would be nothing more than an echo striking glass, and the louder it cried, the more hollow it would sound. She set the photograph down and unconsciously straightened it into line with the others, then asked only one question. Had he verified it 3 times, according to his own rule? Grayson replied that some things didn't need to be verified 3 times, that he had survived this long by never giving anyone the opportunity to strike him twice, and that the attorneys would prepare the papers. She could keep the entire settlement promised in the contract. He wouldn't contest it. He only needed her to leave the tower before the end of the week. Somewhere deep inside him, a small voice screamed that he was making the greatest mistake of his life, that it would be better to lose the entire empire to Preston than to lose this woman, but he strangled that cry with the opposite thought. It would be better to surrender every share to his uncle than to spend one more day beside a second betrayer, because he had survived the first blade all those years ago, but he wasn't certain he could survive this one. Margot nodded without arguing, held the meeting schedule against her chest, and walked out, her heels striking evenly against the stone corridor for the final time. Several days later, on that weekend morning, Grayson stood outside the door to her dressing room, leaning against the frame, and opened his mouth to speak the sentence he had prepared in his mind, as carefully as a contractual clause. Then the doors of the tower closed, and the black car rolled into the heavy snow falling across the avenue, carrying the woman with the old suitcase away from 40 floors of glass and steel. Margot sat with her back straight in the rear seat and never turned to look at the tower receding in the mirror. Only her hand remained quietly over her abdomen throughout the journey, while the snow continued to fall, gradually covering the tracks of the tires, as though the city itself wished to erase every trace of a mistake that the man on the 40th floor wouldn't have the courage to name correctly for a very long time. The room Margot rented was on the 3rd floor of an old red brick building in Pilsen, where the walls along the streets were covered in brightly colored murals, and the scent of toasted corn cakes drifted all the way into the stairwell. The room itself was no larger than her dressing room in the tower, with a cast-iron stove that rattled whenever it burned, and a window overlooking a small bakery with a hand-painted wooden sign. It was that bakery that took her in. Its owner was Rosa Delgado, a silver-haired woman whose hands always carried the scent of cinnamon, and she had taped a notice seeking help with the bookkeeping to the front window on the very day Margot arrived. When Margot walked in to ask about the position, her suitcase not yet fully unpacked, Rosa looked her over once with the eyes of a woman who had lived for 70 years, then told her to come inside and eat a bowl of hot soup before they spoke about paperwork, because she didn't hire people by reading their resumes. She hired them by watching the way they held a spoon when they were hungry. Margot began keeping the bakery's accounts that same day, sitting at a wooden table in a corner fragrant with flour and arranging Rosa's crumpled ledgers into neat, orderly rows. Every evening, when she returned to her small room, she placed a hand over her abdomen and quietly told the tiny life inside her that the 2 of them would be all right. She had already begun again from nothing twice, and this 3rd time, she had her child beside her. At the other end of the city, the 40-story tower was also beginning again, only in the opposite direction. The machine returned to its former condition, precise, silent, and dead. Meals were once again served at the exact minute and removed almost untouched. The staff moved once more like shadows who didn't dare look anyone directly in the eye. The head cook stopped humming. The young night guard greeted people with a lowered head instead of a smile, and no one stayed up late to reconcile the new expense ledger anymore. Grayson had believed that the old order would restore the old peace. He had spent more than 30 years living inside silence, and worshipping it as though it were a form of discipline. Yet now that very silence had turned against him. It was no longer peace. It was an echo. Every empty corridor echoed with the sound of heels that were no longer there. Every dinner he ate alone at the head of the table echoed with the absence of the seat 3 chairs away. He began losing sleep, spending whole nights awake beside files his eyes read and reread, without moving beyond the same line. He grew irritable with employees over mistakes that didn't matter. He snapped at the elderly attorney because a signature had arrived late, and that sharpness, coming from a man who had never raised his voice in his life, told everyone on the 40th floor that something inside their employer had broken. He told himself it was because the internal investigation remained unfinished, because of the new transaction, because of Winter. He offered himself every explanation except the one name he had forbidden his own mind to speak. And perhaps he would have continued deceiving himself much longer if Whitfield hadn't knocked on his office door one evening. The elderly butler entered without the usual tray of liquor. He carried only a small object, which he placed in the center of Grayson's desk, a cheap brown notebook of the kind sold in every stationery store, its spine already worn. Whitfield quietly explained that the room attendant had found it in the desk outside. The lady of the house had a habit of using identical notebooks, one that she carried with her and another that she kept at her desk for work. He believed Grayson should be the one to look through it before it was thrown away. Then he bowed and withdrew, closing the door so gently that it made no sound. Grayson stared at the notebook for a long time as though it were some unfamiliar object. A part of him, the part that had believed the photographs, expected to find the final proof inside. Codes, unknown telephone numbers, notes about him meant to be sold to someone else. He almost hoped he would, because that would allow his verdict to sleep peacefully. Then he opened it. The first page contained Mr. Albie's schedule for taking his joint medication at the club, with the date of his follow-up appointment underlined beside a reminder to arrange a car for him. The next page recorded the birthday of the basement cleaner's young daughter, with a note that the child loved yellow and that her mother had never dared ask for a day off. Then came the anniversary of Whitfield's wife's death, circled beside the words, "White chrysanthemums, glass vase, don't sign the card." After that were the preferences of every member of the household, who needed to avoid salt, who was allergic to nuts, and how the young security guard's payday fell on the same date he sent money to his younger sister for college. He turned each page with fingers that moved more slowly every time, passing through dozens of sheets filled with her orderly, slanting handwriting. He found not a single line about money, shares, or the secrets of the Calloway family. The notebook belonging to the woman he had condemned as a spy contained nothing except the details that no one in his entire security apparatus had been paid to notice. Then, near the final pages, between lines recording meeting schedules, his eyes stopped on a small sentence written in paler ink, as though it had been added hurriedly during a deeply private moment. "Remind G to eat breakfast. He tends to forget when he's under stress." Grayson Calloway, the man the entire city believed was made of steel, sat motionless before that notebook worth only a few dollars for so long that the motion-sensitive desk lamp decided no one remained in the room and turned itself off. And in the darkness of the empty tower he had created with his own hands, he heard, more clearly than ever before, the gears of something inside his chest beginning to turn backward. Grayson had not yet decided what to do about Boone when the game moved another piece on its own, in a way no one had anticipated, not even him. On a gray afternoon, the guard in the lobby called upstairs to report that a woman was asking to see him. She had no appointment, refused to give her name to anyone else, and sent only one message: "Tell Mr. Calloway that the woman who knows the price of $2 million wants 10 minutes of his time." No one on the 40th floor understood what those words meant, but Grayson did. He stood motionless beside his desk for the length of a slow breath, then told them to send her up. Sloane Fairbanks stepped out of the elevator after all those years. Time had taken away the brilliant sharpness she once possessed, and left behind a thinner woman with short hair, wearing a wool coat that had already seen several winters. Only the straightness of her posture remained unchanged. In her hands, she carried an old cardboard box tied with string. He didn't invite her to sit, and she showed no desire to sit. The two people who had once come close to promising each other an entire lifetime stood on opposite sides of a desk, and Sloane spoke first. In the composed voice of someone who had practiced her opening words for many years, she said she hadn't come to ask for forgiveness. She didn't deserve it, and she no longer needed it. She had come because she had read in the financial papers that Grayson Calloway's wife had left this tower, and because she recognized the hand rewriting history as the hand she knew better than anyone. Then she placed the box on the desk, untied the string, and laid before him things he had never known existed. There were old transfer statements, yellowed with age, from a shell company, typed letters without signatures that used letterhead he immediately recognized from a small law firm in the suburbs, and a recording of a telephone call she had secretly kept like a talisman. On it, a familiar, warm male voice instructed her step by step on how to draw close to his nephew, what she was expected to collect, and how much she would be paid for each tape. The person who had paid her all those years ago had never belonged to a rival family, Sloane said. That had been a lie she was paid extra to tell. The man who paid her shared the Calloway bloodline, and when everything collapsed, when she became the woman no law firm wanted to be associated with, he cut off all contact, erased every trace, and discarded her like a torn pair of gloves. She lost her career, lost her name, moved through 4 different cities, and throughout those years, she had kept the box not as a means of blackmail. She swore there had been moments when she was desperate enough to consider it, but she had never found the courage. She had kept it for a reason far smaller and more spiteful, so that every night she could remind herself that she wasn't the only person responsible for destroying her life. Grayson listened to everything without interrupting once. His fingers rested motionless on the desk, and when she finished, he asked only why she had come now, after so many years of silence. Sloane looked at him, and for the first time during the meeting, her voice softened. "Because of that woman," she said. She didn't know his wife, but she had read the reports and recognized the old story being staged again with someone else forced into her role. The difference was that this woman, according to every source Sloane still had, was genuine, and if an innocent woman had to bear the sentence meant for a fraud like her, then there would be nothing left in this world worth defending. She had already ruined one life, her own. She didn't want to die owing the destruction of another. At the bottom of the box, beneath the old papers, was a newer file. Sloane said she still knew a few people who worked in dark offices, and what they had sent her the previous week was the true reason she had overcome her fear and come there that day. Grayson opened the file, and the more he read, the colder the room around him became. It contained fragments of communications concerning the hiring of a group from outside the state, the deposit they had received, and the terms for completing the job. In the line describing the target, his name didn't appear. It had never appeared. There was only a phrase repeated in the chilling language of hired men, the woman in the back seat, and only one person had known the route in advance that day. Everything inside Grayson's mind shifted and locked into place with a dry, brutal sound. Preston had never needed him dead. Preston needed him without an heir. That meant the person who had always needed to disappear was Margot. The bullets that missed her that day had only forced him to replace guns with a blade made of paper. But a man who had patiently planted seeds for decades would never allow one of them to survive. And at that very moment, the woman Preston needed removed from the board was somewhere out there in the Winter City, without guards, without steel walls, without even the Calloway name to shield her. Alone. Grayson surged to his feet so quickly that the heavy leather chair slid backward across the stone floor. Sloane watched the color leave his face and understood that her 10 minutes had ended in the only way that truly mattered. He seized the telephone and called the security team, issuing commands as short as bullets being loaded into a chamber. Find Margot Ellison's current address. Now. Use every source. Pay any price. And in the moment before the voice on the other end confirmed the order, the man who had never known how to pray realized that his heart was repeating only one plea. Please don't let me be too late, because this was no longer a fight to clear her name or restore justice. It had become a race in which the prize was a human life, and the cost of losing was everything that remained of his heart. Grayson's team found the Pilsen address before midnight, and when the head of security reported that the light on the 3rd floor was still on, that the woman was safe beside the wooden table near the window, Grayson stood in the middle of his office and closed his eyes for one long moment like a man who had just been given permission to breathe again. Then he issued 2 orders in immediate succession. First, a covert security perimeter was to be established around the red brick building, day and night, and no one was to let her realize it was there. Second, they were to find a place Preston Whitlock would visit that week without a single press camera nearby. The answer came 2 days later. A private meeting at Warehouse Number 9 in the Southern Harbor, a place Preston still used to meet associates who couldn't conveniently be seen with him in daylight. He was going there to receive the final shipment of documents from the suburban law firm, the originals that had to be destroyed once the game was complete. And Grayson decided that the game would indeed be completed, only with a different man delivering checkmate. That night, fog rose from the surface of the lake and swallowed the harbor, leaving the high-security lights as nothing more than blurred yellow halos in the damp air. Preston Whitlock entered Warehouse Number 9 with 6 escorts, as confident as though he were walking into his own sitting room, until the steel doors behind him descended one after another, and Grayson Calloway stepped out from behind the towering containers into the pool of light at the center of the warehouse. He was alone, both hands hanging at his sides, with no weapon anywhere on his body. And it was that solitude that made all 6 escorts hesitate, because in their world, a man willing to stand alone like that could only be insane, or already certain he held every card. Preston chose to believe the first. He gave the familiar smile of a philanthropist. opened his arms in greeting, and asked in his warm, deep voice why his nephew had chosen such a damp place for their meeting. The escort, standing closest to him, misread the faint tightening of his employer's brow and reached beneath his coat for a weapon. It was the last movement Preston's men were allowed to make by their own choice that night. Grayson gave only the slightest nod, as brief as a man acknowledging a greeting, and the darkness between the containers came alive. His people had been waiting there since before Preston's car had even left the cherry wood-paneled study. They moved in from 3 directions at once, swift and quiet as wind sweeping through the building. The metallic clatter of weapons striking the concrete sounded before the first cry could rise, and by the time Preston turned to look, it was already over. His 6 men had been subdued with clean precision, kneeling in a row with their faces pressed against the containers and their wrists restrained behind their backs. No one had bled. Not a single shot had been fired. The entire takedown lasted less than one long breath and unfolded with such order that it looked rehearsed. For the first time in decades, Preston Whitlock stood inside a room he didn't control. Grayson walked toward him at an unhurried pace, adjusting the silver cuff link at his wrist as though he had just finished some minor household task, then said in the same even voice he had used from the beginning that, as his uncle could see, he didn't need to raise his voice. His people could hear even the things he hadn't yet said. The old man recovered his composure with remarkable speed. The Callaway blood in his veins had to be given that much credit. He smoothed the lapels of his coat and immediately shifted into the language of negotiation, saying that they were family, that every misunderstanding had its price, and asking Grayson to name a number. Grayson merely raised one finger, and silence returned at once. Then he gave a signal, and the head of security stepped forward and placed a thick, carefully bound file on the wooden crate between them. Grayson opened the cover with one finger, slowly, as though turning the page of a menu, and began reading the table of contents aloud for his uncle. Part 1. 10 years of draining family funds through a chain of shell companies, accompanied by the original bank records the suburban law firm intended to destroy that night. Part 2. The files documenting bribery and the manufacture of false evidence used to frame an innocent citizen, accompanied by notarized statements from the witness who had withdrawn his testimony, and from a female attorney Preston had abandoned many years before. He shouldn't teach other people how to keep secrets when he had never learned that lesson himself. Part 3. Communications concerning the hiring of an armed group from outside the state. Grayson believed federal prosecutors would study that section far more closely than he ever could. Preston's face changed from ruddy to gray as each section was read aloud, and when he opened his mouth to speak, Grayson closed the file, looked directly into his eyes for the first time that night, and delivered the rest in the voice of a man reading the final clause of a contract. "You calculated every move correctly except one, Uncle. You believed I would deal with you according to the laws of this harbor. Instead, every original document from the suburban law firm was intercepted an hour ago." Stripped of his leverage and watching his network crumble in a single night, Preston stood silent as Grayson turned away, leaving the old man surrounded by his disarmed guards in the damp dark. Preston was not arrested that night, but he was backed into a corner, a dangerous position for a man with nothing left to lose. Boone's confession continued until nearly dawn, inside the small conference room where the old driver sat across from the attorneys, with both hands clasped tightly on the table like a man in prayer. He told them everything. From the day Preston approached him in the corridor of the treatment center with the first check, to the brown envelope, to the route across the iron bridge that he had chosen under orders, after being assured that no one would be harmed, that they only meant to frighten the lady of the house into leaving. He had foolishly clung to that promise like a man clutching a single piece of straw in a violent current. Grayson listened from behind the frosted glass and never entered the room, because he knew that if he stepped inside, he wouldn't be able to keep his voice steady. But the thing that struck him down wasn't among those crimes. It came near the end, when Boone lifted his hollow, exhausted face and said there was one more thing they needed to know, something he had heard from Preston's people during their final exchange. The reason the old man had begun making more desperate moves was that he had received information from a source inside the private medical world. Mrs. Ellison was pregnant, perhaps from before the day she left the tower. Those words passed through the frosted glass, through Grayson's charcoal gray suit, and drove straight into the center of his chest like something none of his armor had ever been designed to stop. He left that corridor with the steps of a man relearning how to walk, climbed into his car, and sat motionless for a long time without starting the engine. Only one image repeated inside his mind. The woman who had signed the papers without a word of protest carried her old suitcase through the door while bearing his child inside her, and he had stood leaning against the frame, watching her leave with a sentence already waiting on his lips. That very night, before dawn had broken, the elderly attorney was summoned to the 40th floor for a task he wasn't permitted to question and wasn't allowed to mention to anyone. The two men sat together until the buildings beyond the glass changed from black to gray. And when the old lawyer finally departed, his briefcase held an additional set of documents, bearing a title he had never seen in 40 years of service to that family. In the days that followed, Margot Ellison's life began growing lighter in ways she couldn't explain. The old hospital debt, the shadow that had pressed down upon her shoulders for years, vanished from the system one morning. The letter she received stated only that the balance had been settled through an adjustment, with no name of the person who had paid it and no return address. She called the billing office 3 times, and all 3 times she received the same mechanical answer, that the file had been closed. Meanwhile, Rosa's bakery unexpectedly secured a contract to supply bread and pastries to a large hotel chain, leaving the elderly owner crossing herself while she kneaded the dough. Margot wasn't a woman who believed in miracles. She was a woman of numbers, and numbers always had a source. She began to guess the truth on snowy afternoons, when the neighborhood lights came on early, and she sat at the wooden table in the corner of the bakery with the account books open before her. Through the window clouded with steam, she first caught only a brief glimpse of a tall figure in a dark overcoat, standing across the street beneath the awning of a closed shop, snow resting on both shoulders as though he had been there for a very long time. The second time, she looked more carefully, and her heart recognized him before her eyes did. That rigid, motionless posture, that precisely measured distance. She quickly lowered her gaze to the ledger, tightening her hand around the pen, and waited for the bell above the bakery door to ring. It never did. When she looked up again, there was nothing across the street, except snow drifting through the yellow light and a patch of sidewalk where footprints were already fading beneath the white. And so it continued, afternoon after afternoon. The man came and stood on the far side of the narrow street, but never crossed it. He, who had walked through rooms filled with guns without blinking, who had brought an entire harbor to its knees with a single nod. I couldn't find the courage to cross 7 yards of snow and push open a wooden door with a bell hanging above it. What could he possibly say? I'm sorry? Those 2 words were far too small for what he had done, and for the first time in his life, that man understood fear in a specific form. He feared that she would look at him with the same eyes he had turned upon her that afternoon in his office. Margot didn't open the door either. She didn't step outside, though one afternoon her hand rested upon the doorknob before slowly falling away. A woman who had been cast aside by life twice and falsely condemned once couldn't be the one to cross the street first. She had already walked her entire share of the distance during those 11 months. The rest belonged to him. And so, through the long winter afternoons, only a narrow snow-covered street lay between them, 2 lighted windows facing each other, and an apology suspended in the falling sky without ever reaching the ground, like snowflakes drifting endlessly inside the glow of a yellow street lamp, while neither of those proud souls yet possessed the courage to reach out and catch it first. The fiercest snowstorm of that winter swept over the city late one afternoon, with winds from the lake lashing white sheets of snow through the streets, while the radio warned everyone to remain indoors. And Grayson Calloway, as he had done every afternoon for weeks, still ordered the car to stop at the end of the narrow street in Pilsen and walk to his familiar place beneath the awning across the road. But something was wrong that day. The bakery window was dark behind the driving snow. The hand-painted wooden sign swung in the wind before the tightly closed door. There was no pool of yellow light, no familiar figure bent over a ledger at the wooden table in the corner, and inside Grayson's chest, a premonition colder than the storm began to rise. He crossed that street for the first time, the 7 yards of snow he hadn't dared cross through all those afternoons, and now he covered them in 3 long strides. He struck the wooden door with his hand, and from a small upstairs window, Rosa Delgado leaned out, recognized the man standing in the snow, and didn't ask who he was. The 70-year-old woman had seen him standing across the street on enough afternoons to understand. She only called down through the wind, her voice heavy, that the girl had been taken to the hospital earlier that afternoon. She had collapsed beside the bookkeeping table from exhaustion. They said she had been working too much and eating far too little. If he was her person, he needed to go to her. St. Anthony Hospital. And young man, Rosa added when he had already turned away, don't stand outside the door this time. The black car tore through the storm toward St. Anthony Hospital in a length of time no driver would have dared promise under ordinary conditions, and Grayson entered the emergency lobby with the stride of a man accustomed to commanding the world. He had already made 3 calls from the car. He knew the name of the department chief. He had numbers ready in his mind that could turn an entire hospital floor into a private wing. But the night nurse on duty, a middle-aged woman whose eyes had seen too many frightened men, simply looked at him over the rims of her glasses and asked one question. "What are you to the patient?" Grayson Calloway, who had never once found himself speechless at any negotiating table, stood there with snow melting across the shoulders of his overcoat, opened his mouth, and couldn't find an answer. Her husband? The papers he had personally placed before her still lay somewhere between them. Her family? He had sent her away with nothing in the middle of winter. The nurse read his silence in her own way and told him gently but firmly that the patient had been ordered to rest completely, and that only immediate family members were permitted inside after visiting hours. He could sit and wait. And so the man who could control an entire city with a single telephone call sat down on a row of gray plastic chairs in the medical ward corridor, surrounded by the smell of disinfectant and the glow of fluorescent lights, and learned the lesson hospital hallways had taught millions before him. Some doors couldn't be opened with money. Some lists couldn't be rearranged by any name. His power, the power that had brought an entire harbor to its knees with a nod, couldn't buy him so much as a plastic visitor's pass in that place. He sat there for hours, holding his snow-soaked overcoat across his arms, watching cleaners push their carts back and forth, and for the first time, he understood the Margot of years before, the woman who had sat on rows of chairs just like those night after night, alone, burdened by bottomless bills, with no one in the world to call. The thought forced him to bend forward, both elbows resting on his knees, like a man crushed beneath an invisible weight. Near midnight, the door to the room at the end of the corridor opened slightly as a young nurse carried in a file for review, and Grayson, who had paced the hallway until he had nearly worn a path into the floor, stopped close to the narrow opening. He hadn't meant to listen, but the late-night corridor was so quiet that every word from inside carried clearly. The young nurse gently asked, "Miss Ellison, according to hospital policy, I need to complete your emergency contact information. Could you give me the name of a relative we should notify if necessary? A parent, a brother or sister, or your husband?" Then, after a brief silence, came the voice he had heard for 11 months, through reports and dinners. The same composed voice, still as orderly as when she recited figures. "Please write that there is no one. I don't have anyone left." Those words, spoken without a trace of accusation and without a single tear, as calmly as someone filling an empty space on a form, passed through the opening and struck Grayson Calloway down in a way no gun in his life ever had. He stepped backward. His back met the corridor wall, and he slowly slid down until he was sitting on the cold tile floor. The man the entire city believed was made of steel sat beneath a hospital wall like every broken soul who had sat there before him. Because he understood, with the merciless precision of a man who had spent his life reading figures, that her answer wasn't an expression of self-pity, it was an honest declaration. Her father had died when she was young. Her mother she had buried alone beside a windswept grave. Her fiancé had abandoned her for money. And the only man in the world whose name had ever stood beside hers on a legal document had leaned against a doorway and told her not to touch anything that belonged to him. She had no one left, and in the long list of people who had abandoned that woman one after another, he, Grayson Calloway, occupied the final and most unforgivable place. He remained there for a very long time in the late-night hospital corridor, listening to the snowstorm howl against the windows, and made a vow to himself without documents or conditions that even if it cost him the rest of his life, he would make the answer to that question change. Grayson remained at St. Anthony Hospital through the nights that followed. He didn't enter her room. He merely changed the place where he waited, moving from the awning across the narrow street in Pilsen to the row of gray plastic chairs at the far end of the medical ward corridor. Each evening, he brought his briefcase of work with him, as though the hospital's 4th floor had become the corporation's newest office, and the nurses on the night shift gradually grew accustomed to the man in the dark overcoat, who sat there in silence until late, then left before the morning change of shift. No one knew who he was. They only knew that the fresh flowers at the nurse's station never wilted, and that a new coffee machine had suddenly appeared in the family waiting room. Knowing his empire was sliding through his fingers, and aware that Grayson's 35th birthday was fast approaching, Preston refused to accept defeat. When his informants revealed that Margot Ellison was secretly admitted to St. Anthony Hospital, the desperate old man saw his final move on the board. He would cut through the noise, bypass the legal maneuvers, and strike directly at the one thing Grayson was protecting. That night, when Grayson stepped out of the elevator into the hospital parking garage at his usual quiet hour, 4 unfamiliar men emerged from behind the concrete pillars and closed in around his black car. From the darkness between 2 rows of vehicles, Preston Whitlock appeared, visibly thinner, his eyes sunken, though his voice still strained to preserve its warm, deep tone as he said, "My dear nephew, let us settle right and wrong between us one final time." Then he snapped his fingers. One of the men placed a prepared set of documents and a pen on the hood of the car. "A transfer of all controlling shares," Preston said. "Sign it, and in return, my people will permanently forget the way to the 4th floor of this hospital. They will forget the woman lying there as well. But if you prefer to play the hero, remember that my instructions are already sitting in the pockets of several men out there, and even if I go to prison, I won't be able to withdraw them in time." The 4 men tightened the circle by 1 step, and Preston waited. He waited for anger, for negotiation, for that famous even voice to begin measuring costs and consequences. He had prepared for every possible reaction from his nephew, except the one that actually came. Grayson Calloway looked at him for 1 second, exactly 1 second, then walked to the hood, picked up the pen, and signed. He didn't reread a single line. He didn't question a single clause. His familiar sharp signature appeared at the bottom of the page so quickly that even the man holding the papers froze in surprise. The entire garage fell silent, and somewhere behind the concrete pillars, time itself seemed to hold its breath. The man who had spent half his life building and protecting that empire had just surrendered it with 1 stroke of ink and without a blink. Preston snatched up the documents and checked the signature with fingers trembling from triumph. But just as he raised his head, ready to deliver some condescending final remark, Grayson spoke first, his voice still as even as when he read a report. "Take that paper with you, Uncle. Take it home and frame it. But let me save you some legal fees. That document won't buy you a single share, because I gave away what you want a long time ago. On the very night I learned I was going to be a father, every controlling share in the corporation was transferred into an irrevocable trust. The beneficiary is my unborn child, and it became legally effective before a notary's seal, long before you had time to imagine tonight's little performance. I'm nothing more than a paid manager working for my own child now, and you understand inheritance law better than anyone. What can the signature of an employee possibly sell? I gave everything away to the only person in this family who has never betrayed anyone." Preston's face passed through an entire lifetime in the space of a few seconds, from triumph to disbelief, from disbelief to horror, and from horror to the fury of a man who had just watched the final move of his life fall into an empty square. He roared, all warmth gone from his voice, and flung out 1 hand in command. The 4 men rushed forward, but before they could touch Grayson's collar, the garage flooded with light. Vehicles sealed both ramps, and Grayson's people poured from stairwells they had controlled since before the old man ever entered the garage. The brief struggle ended in less than a breath, with all 4 men pinned face down against the hoods of the nearest cars. Then red and blue lights began sweeping across the concrete ceiling. Federal agents, who had tracked Preston's movements since the harbor incident, entered and read out the emergency arrest order. This time, no expensive attorney would be able to free him. Preston Whitlock was led past his nephew, still twisting around to spit out 1 final question in a shattered voice. "You're insane. No one places an entire empire into the hands of a child who hasn't even been born." Grayson stood in the middle of the garage with both hands in the pockets of his overcoat and answered with words that those present that night would repeat for years. "You're wrong, Uncle. You spent your whole life believing this empire was the most valuable thing in the Calloway family, and that is why you lost. It was never worth as much as the woman lying on the 4th floor. And I am insane. I only regret that I became insane too late." Margot learned what had happened in the parking garage from the young nurse, who recounted it as though describing a scene from a movie, saying that federal agents had arrested a powerful tycoon right there in the hospital, and that the man in the dark overcoat, who had been sitting at the far end of the corridor every night for the past several days, had somehow been involved. Margot listened with 1 hand still resting over her abdomen and looked through the window, where the snow had stopped falling without her even noticing. Then, that evening, when the corridor had grown quiet, and the light in her room had softened into the gentle yellow glow of the resting hour, she said one brief sentence to the nurse. "If the man outside is still there, please let him come in." Grayson stepped through that doorway like a man crossing the boundary between two lives. He, who had once strode through marble lobbies and warehouses filled with guns at the same unchanging pace, now stopped awkwardly at the foot of the hospital bed, uncertain where to put his hands, his overcoat draped across one arm like a lowered flag. Beneath the yellow light, they looked at each other for the first time since that afternoon in the office on the 40th floor. She was thinner, but her eyes were unchanged. They were still the same eyes that had looked at him over the crooked stack of files on her first day, calm and unwilling to lower themselves. He began to speak, and his words sounded unlike anything he had ever said in his life. There were no conditions, no measured rhythm of a man reading a report. He stumbled over his sentences, stopped halfway through, and began again, like someone learning an entirely new language, with a tongue stiffened by years of ice. He said that he had been wrong from the moment he opened that envelope, wrong to let an old wound guide his hand as it wrote a sentence against an innocent woman. He said he hadn't come to ask her to return, because he had no right to ask that of her. He had only come to say the 3 words he owed her. Then that man offered his apology slowly and clearly, lowering his head as he spoke, as though the words truly carried a physical weight. "I am sorry." The room remained silent for a long while. There was only the steady breathing of the heating system and the faint ticking of the leather-strapped watch on her left wrist. Then Margot pushed herself upright against the pillows, looked directly at him, and spoke in the composed voice that had carried her through every ruin in her life. "I need you to understand something, and I need you to understand it correctly. I didn't hide the baby from you because I was afraid, and I didn't do it to punish you. I remained silent because I didn't want my child to become the reason you decided I had value. I have been assigned a price too many times in my life. Once, someone weighed me against a dowry, and I lost. You placed me inside a contract with an inheritance condition, and I signed it. But my child will never be permitted to become a condition. If there ever comes a day when you cherish me, I want it to be because of the woman who stayed awake late into the night, balancing every dollar in your ledgers, who found a thief between 2 layers of your auditors, who stood straight inside your tower without asking anyone for anything. Because of that woman, not because of the cradle." Grayson Calloway stood at the foot of the bed, a man who had listened to declarations of war and desperate pleas without allowing his expression to change, who had answered men holding guns in the same steady voice and found himself unable to speak. His lips parted, then closed again, because every word he possessed had been forged for negotiating tables, and what stood before him wasn't a negotiation. It was a human being whole in her dignity, rising higher than him from a hospital bed. All he could do was nod, slowly and deeply, almost like a bow. After a while, when the breathing of the room had settled, Margot continued in the practical tone of someone accustomed to arranging every matter cleanly. "Before the baby was born," she said, "they should meet with the attorney once and put the documents in proper order. The petition from that day had already been submitted, so it was up to him how he wished to proceed with the remaining steps. She wanted everything made clear for the child's future." And at that moment, Grayson did something strange. He placed his overcoat over the arm of the chair, reached into the inner pocket, and removed a folded envelope worn along the crease, as though it had been carried close to someone's body for many days. He offered it to her with both hands. Margot opened it and recognized the divorce petition from that afternoon. Her signature was still there, sharp and straight exactly as she remembered it. But the space reserved for the husband's signature remained completely blank, without a single stroke of ink, and there was no court filing stamp anywhere at the top of the page. She looked up, and Grayson spoke in a voice that had recovered its steadiness, though it was a different kind of steadiness now, deeper and more human. He told her that he had held a pen over that document on the night she signed it, but he hadn't been able to put the pen to the page. He had carried it with him ever since, through the harbor, through every afternoon spent standing across the street, through the parking garage, like the one piece of evidence he had never dared place in anyone else's hands. It was proof that even in the worst moment of his life, some part of him had still known the truth. Legally, and in every other way he had only just found the courage to name, she had never left him. Baby June was born on a morning near the end of winter, when the last patches of snow were melting from the rooftops and sunlight was beginning to find its way back through the windows of St. Anthony Hospital. She gave her first cry in a room filled with warm light, healthy and rosy, with a small tuft of black hair like her father's and eyes that everyone would later say looked exactly like those of her grandmother, the schoolteacher she would know only through the leather-strapped watch on her mother's wrist. That clear, bright cry carried into the hallway, and Grayson Calloway, the man who had remained standing through every storm of his life, had to reach for the doorframe, because the knees of the man who had once walked through a harbor filled with guns suddenly refused to obey him. Then, when the nurse placed that tiny warm bundle into his arms, he held his daughter with all the awkwardness of a man embracing something more precious than his own life for the first time. His arms were stiff, as though he were holding a crystal vase, and his back bent at such a peculiar angle that the nurse had to turn away to hide her smile. Margot watched from the bed as the man the whole city believed was made of steel held his breath over a life small enough to fit within his arms. And she smiled in a way she hadn't smiled throughout all the long years before. In the seasons that followed, the city witnessed something it had never seen before. The Calloway empire quietly shed its old skin. The casinos were sold or converted into properly licensed entertainment complexes. The dealings conducted in darkness were unraveled one thread at a time, with the patience of someone loosening a tangled ball of yarn. Any of his people who wished to begin again were given honest work, and whispers spread through the underworld that the raven at the head of the flock had washed the darkness from his wings. Some mocked him, others mourned what had been lost. But when Grayson signed the final conversion document, he said only one thing to the elderly attorney. All his life, he had believed power meant making an entire city fear him. He now understood that the greatest power a man could ever possess was a home with the lights on and someone waiting for him to return. At the naming celebration for baby June, Nadia Calloway, Grayson's aunt, came to visit the tower that had changed so completely. Before leaving, she drew Margot aside to stand beside the wall of glass overlooking the river and spoke with the bluntness of a woman past 60 who had long since stopped softening her words. She said she had watched 3 generations of Calloway men marry for advantage and love very badly, his grandfather, his father, and then Grayson himself. The last time she came, she had expected to watch Margot break apart like every woman who had entered that family before her. Yet Margot had done something Nadia had never witnessed. She had melted the ice without shattering herself. Nadia said she didn't understand how she had managed it. Margot only answered that she had never intended to melt anything. She had merely meant to keep the ledgers in straight lines, and everything else had followed on its own. Many years later, in a sitting room warm with firelight on a winter evening, June, by then old enough to question everything in the world, sat between her parents and asked the question every child eventually asks, "How did you and Mommy fall in love?" Margot looked at her husband through the firelight, waiting to see how he would manage the answer. Grayson, whose hair now held its first strands of silver, set down the book he had been reading, considered the question for a moment, then answered his daughter in the steady voice that had grown warm through the years. Once, long ago, he had foolishly forbidden her mother to touch anything that belonged to him. He had believed that was how he could keep everything safe. Only much later did he understand that her mother was the only person in the world who had never taken anything from him. She had only left things behind. She had left him a home, a heart that knew how to beat again, and she had left him June. And that is where the story ends, beside the firelight of a family that began with a cold contract. Perhaps what remains after everything else is this: a person's worth isn't measured by what they bring into our lives, but by the dignity they preserve, even when we give them no reason to remain kind. Don't assign a price to someone according to what you might receive from them, because some people enter our lives with empty hands and leave behind an inheritance no ledger could ever contain. And no matter how long a human heart has remained frozen, it always has a chance to thaw when it encounters a kindness patient enough to stay. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it so we can continue listening to more compelling stories every day. How did this story make you feel? And what moved you the most? Please share your thoughts in the comments so we can hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and we will see you again in the next video.